Hi, I'm Karen McConnell. I'm a professor of kinesiology at Pacific Lutheran University.
Hi, I'm Terri Farrar. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology at Pacific Lutheran University.
Terri and I are co-authors and contributing authors to a number of texts, including Fitness for Life, Health for Life, and Live Well Middle School Health. And we're here today to talk to you about developing health skills in middle school. The first thing I want to do is start out by acknowledging that skills-based health education has been with us for a long time. If you look back to the Education for All conference in 1990, it appeared there, and it's appeared in various forms in various places since, including our National Health Education Standards. So the value of teaching skills in health is long held, and the challenges in doing so are still being addressed. Some of the struggles we have with skills-based health education is figuring out how to best develop the skills and how to assess students' progress on those skills. I think for many teachers, it's easy to fall back on assessing for content knowledge only because it's familiar and it seems to be more objective in some way. So even when skills are being developed through learning activities and assignments, we will often employ quizzes or worksheets that are heavily focused on the recall of information. So one of the critical things to do is to become comfortable with the idea of assessing skills themselves. And it's also important that we recognize that there's an interplay between content knowledge, skill development, and behavior change. One of the ways we can think about skills and content and behavior change is through an analogy. I like to use golf. So the ultimate goal when you're playing golf is to be able to play the game. And in order to do that, you need some foundational knowledge. You need to know the rules and the desired outcomes. You need to know which club is needed when, how to address the ball depending on the club and swing you are desiring, and an understanding of how to execute the swing in order to move the ball towards the target. You need to have an understanding of the intensity with which you want to hit the ball, and you need to understand the common mistakes in striking the ball, and so on and so forth. So in other words, you need to have some foundational knowledge in order to move forward with your skill development. You also need to be able to execute the swing, which means you need to have the skill itself. It's not enough to just know about it. We need to practice swinging the club and making contact with the ball. We need to be able to execute the backswing, the strike, the follow through. We need to be able to recognize that there are common parts to all swings, while also being aware that the swing may need to be adjusted slightly depending on the club we're using and the goal we're trying to achieve. So we address the ball differently, we stand differently, we swing differently, depending on how we're trying to use that skill. And it's similar in developing health skills. We have a set of skills and we want to practice them with different content so that we can learn the nuances of their execution. The way in which we combine our knowledge and our swing will dictate the direction the ball travels and how close it lands to the target. So it's a combination of what we know and how we execute that ultimately gets us to where we're trying to go. So in this way, you can think of the ball and where it lands as sort of the progress you've made on behavior and behavior change. We can't hope for behavior to change in the direction we want it to without adequately teaching both knowledge and skills. So when we look at what to include, we have a set of skills in our National Health Education Standards that kind of guide our direction there. And the content knowledge is pretty well understood, either through what your school or district requires of you or what through some national governing bodies might suggest are critical components of content. So up on this slide, you see the combination of the most commonly taught content as well as the health skills. If we want to think about how we develop health skills, we can think of it as taking steps up in our progress. So we need to start by teaching the skill itself. We have to introduce what it is. So for example, what is goal setting? What does goal setting look like? How is it done? When do you use it? Why might you use it? So a basic introduction to the skill itself. We need to guide the skill development with appropriate steps or cues so that we know the way to execute the skill. And then we need to model the execution of the skill. We usually do that by reading about the skill in case studies or by doing scenarios or stories or role playing. So we're trying to develop the skill in those ways. We need to continue to practice the skill. We need to practice it with each content area that makes sense, and we need to practice the skill more than one time. Now think about the putt and the drive in golf. Even though both are forms of swings, so they're both the same skill, that the fundamentals and the nuances and the differences exist between the two. So you need to practice sometimes with the putter and sometimes with the driver. And so in the same way, we need to practice our skills with different content areas. We also need to allow time for skills to be acquired. Skill development does not just happen with a single exposure to a skill. You can't just do it once and then call it done and be an expert. So in this way, skills-based health education needs to be repetitive. We really need to have a lot of practice. We need to allow for mistakes to occur and to grow from those mistakes, and to recognize that it's going to take some time for skills to develop. And we also can't expect there to be real meaningful behavior change simply because we have knowledge and we taught a skill. It takes time, practice, repetition in order to have that skill develop the way or change the way we behave. We can look at skill development sort of in the same way we might look at motor skill acquisition. So I'm not going to go into this in detail other than to say there's an initial phase where you need to have knowledge be acquired. So the content needs to be acquired. And it's okay, I think, in skills-based health education to spend some time working on developing your content knowledge. When we work with students with content, we're also reinforcing some other important learning, like organizing and categorizing information, recalling information, reading comprehension, critically analyzing information and facts, and etc. At this stage, we also need to know what the skill is and learn about the skill itself. So we need to learn, for example, what is a SMART goal? What does SMART stand for? What are these? What do they look like? When should I use them? So the knowledge about the skill itself. The next thing we do is begin to take that knowledge base and transform it into some actions. We practice by using role play scenarios, storyboards, etc. We take small, shorter term, low stakes steps ourselves, and then we make mistakes, we grow from those mistakes, and eventually take bigger actions over time. And finally, we hopefully get to the place where the skill is fully developed, we're practicing it, and the behavior that follows will change and become habitual. So that's really sort of an analogy to how we would acquire motor skills. It's not that different from how we might acquire health skills. And then the other complexity here is that our health skills are generally also behaviors. And behavior change is really complicated and complex. It's messy. There's a lot of things that influence our health behaviors. And many of those things are influenced by our level of knowledge and our level of awareness about that health behavior. We see the complexity of trying to change behavior expressed in common theories of behavior change. So I put some of those up on the slide just to sort of give an example of how complicated health behavior change can be. Things like threats, norms, risks, seriousness of the situation, our skills, our values, our intentions, all of those things influence human behavior. So if I'm trying to think of an example on the spot, so I apologize. If I want to know about approaches to healthy eating, or if I want to change my eating behavior, I have to know about what healthy eating is first and foremost. Then I have to have a value and an appreciation for why healthy eating is important. If I don't know about it and I don't have a value about it, I probably won't recognize my need to change to begin with, and I won't know what to do even to take a step to learn more. So we have to have some knowledge to influence our values and influence our intentions so that we can ultimately change our behavior. When we think about behavior change in a health class, we don't have a lot of time to see behavior change. You have a semester at most. It's typically too short to really see that kind of change, and we don't have time to monitor that kind of change. So as a result of that, we often do what's easy, and that's to measure changes in content knowledge and basic skill execution. And that's probably a realistic thing to have happen in health class. But the thing that then happens is people don't know how to do the skill part. So then we just fall back on measuring changes to content knowledge, and that's not enough. The goal is to make sure we incorporate assessments of skill acquisition and practice, and that we don't just focus on the acquisition of content knowledge. And as we think about assessing skill development holistically across a course, we can see more clearly and recognize how we might better develop opportunities for skill development. So I'm going to pass it off to Terri, who's going to walk you through some different ways we might work with skill development in a health course.
So building off what Karen said, we have two models that we can really work with. Teachers can decide how they want to teach, either by content or by developing health skills. And I'm going to use some examples from our Live Well middle school health textbook. Typical content information could include a student's self-assessment, some learning vocabulary, meeting learning targets, taking notes, set induction, such as a write about activity, just the typical content that you would find in a textbook. And that's really where most teachers will start at. In this specific lesson, students are going to begin with a scenario about a middle school students which middle school students can relate to. And they're going to be asked a few questions about what they as individuals think about the scenario or what they may have done differently if in the same situation. Teachers could use this to work on analyzing influences on decision-making and communication skills. So right away, we're trying to get students engaged in a lesson on emotional health and in using those health skills associated with skills-based health. Then the content of the lesson begins with the first section of the lesson defining what emotional health and mental health are. These are vocabulary terms that in a typical textbook, they're in some other color, so students can really kind of understand that this is a key word that I need to be familiar with. Again, using our textbook as an example, on this page there's a healthy living tip. And this healthy living tip gives students ideas on how they can learn to express their emotions appropriately. So students have just learned that both positive and negative emotions should be shared, and that sometimes that's really difficult to do. So the healthy living tip gives them an idea of how they may want to practice sharing their emotions appropriately. This could be just informational for the students, or a teacher could use this to focus on communication skills and practicing that health-enhancing behavior of being able to share their emotions appropriately. In this section on developing empathy, it could be used to have students discuss their write about it from the beginning of the lesson. So the write about it was about when was the last time you felt empathy towards a friend? Students may not have actually known what empathy was to begin with. So now they've got a definition and a better understanding. A teacher could take a moment and give students an opportunity to maybe do a rewrite or share their write about with another classmate, which would focus on the skill of communication. And we could focus on those students using I messages and active listening as they're communicating with each other in terms of what empathy towards a friend might look like. In terms of using the skill building, the skills in health, we want to make sure that we've got something that they can really use those health skills for. And so in these examples, the skill building challenge focuses on health knowledge and communication skills, specifically on being able to communicate empathy. So we're using that content knowledge, and students would again be working on I messages and active listening skills as they go about talking about and creating an actual skit for empathy. In this lesson, the students had just learned about the importance of communicating their emotions in a healthy way. They've learned what empathy is and how to develop empathy. So they've got that content knowledge now, and they're going to use that content and create a skit using both the skills of health knowledge and communication. If a teacher didn't want to work on the skill of communication in this lesson, they could also choose to work on analyzing influences or accessing information. Both are related to information or content learned in the lesson, and both are important health skills for students to understand and learn. There's also health skill graphics there that you will see on the slide, and that's used throughout our text for students to use as a reminder of the steps for that particular health skill. Then we move from a teacher who may want to use specific content as their tool to a teacher who wants to focus on a specific health skill. In this example, we've used analyzing influences, and we've chosen lessons from 3 different chapters. In this first example, we're analyzing influences through wellness. This has students focus on the 5 parts of wellness, and then for each part of wellness to identify a personal, a social, environmental, or genetic influence. Teachers could have students brainstorm what those influences might be, or they could have students read the section on influences on health and wellness. So they wouldn't have to be using the entire chapter that this is coming from, but just this one section so students again have that content knowledge before trying to analyze those influences. So this way students would have the content knowledge and be able to focus on the skill of analyzing influences. The second example shows analyzing influences on bullying or cyberbullying. So students would analyze their risk of either being a bully or being bullied through the influences of their peers, family, media, etc. Teachers could have students again brainstorm what those influences might be and have them do some critical thinking in terms of kind of their own experiences or just experiences that they may be familiar with. They could also have them read the section on influences on bullying behavior and cyberbullying. So students would have actual content that they could draw from as well. The last example is on students' decisions about using tobacco products and how they are influenced positively or negatively, and who or what those influences might be. Students could have some content information on the tobacco products by teachers using the section on factors that influence tobacco use and the section on tobacco norming in society. So really, regardless of whether a teacher chooses to teach the health skills through using content or decide to focus on a specific skill using a variety of content, students need to have multiple opportunities to practice those skills, to become familiar with them, and to really be able to use skills-based health throughout a curriculum. As Karen mentioned, part of what kind of teachers, we get comfortable with teaching that content. And a lot of that sometimes has to do with that we don't know how to assess a skill. We're very capable of assessing content. And so regardless of whether teachers choose to teach content and they use the health skills, or they choose to focus on mastering a health skill, regardless of the content they're using, we've developed rubrics that can be used in both of those scenarios. So teachers will be able to assess both skills and content. The first rubric is an analytical rubric. It assesses the health skill of analyzing influences. The second one also also assesses the health skill of analyzing influences, but is done in a holistic manner. And the third one shows a combination holistic rubric, which assesses both the content and the health skill. So regardless of how the teacher might want to either teach content, teach the health skill, there are a variety of ways that the teacher could go about assessing both the content and the skill, and making it very simple for both themselves and the student to understand.
All right. We're really glad you joined us today for our presentation. We hope that we've basically been able to remind everybody of the importance of working on health skills and health education, and to consider that there are really multiple ways you might go about doing that. And you can do it in a organized, content-driven class if you're intentional about it and intentional about building in the skill development opportunities and repeating opportunities over time. Or if you want to organize by skill and just use the content as a way to have students express the different skills as you go through the class. So thanks again. And if you want to learn more, you can see our middle school text, Live Well Middle School Health. Thanks.